second part of perceiving objects and scenes. The first theoretical approach to object recognition, or how we're going to handle some of those challenges to object recognition, is the recognition by components theory. So this theory, proposed by Irving Biederman in 1987, suggested that all objects can be described using a finite set of three-dimensional shapes that he called geons, these very basic elements or ions of our geometric world, basically. And he had 36 of them, where he said we can, with those 36 geons, describe a lot, many of the easily recognizable objects in our world. And again, he had some pretty nice evidence. And then we also said, hey, this is a really bottom-up approach. It doesn't help us with how background knowledge and previous experience help or influence our ability to recognize objects. The second approach to how we recognize objects that I just briefly introduced in the first part of this series of PowerPoints was the Gestalt psychology idea of how we are performing this perceptual organization, and that it isn't about discrete sensations, right? Like this light coming on and then there being darkness and then another light coming on in a new place. What we end up seeing, if that darkness is timed with the right timing, is the light comes on at the left and it moves over to the right, even though that's not what actually happened. This kind of illusory movement, this apparent motion, shows us that the sum is more than, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And the thing about Gestalt psychology, when they're talking about that whole, is that the whole is different than the sum of its parts. And again, as structuralism was trying to give us these discrete sensations that we could build up this whole, but the Gestalt psychologists saw that the whole was something different. If we take those pieces and parts of a bicycle and we just look at the pieces and parts, like on the left, they're not very meaningful and they're not very helpful to us. But then if we put them together in this particular arrangement where we get a bicycle, that bicycle as the whole object, that is what's helpful and what's recognizable as an object that has some function. So their emphasis was on perceptual organization, or how we organize this perceptual space. Another really great example of the whole being different than the sum of its parts, if we go through what you see in A, you might start seeing the outline of a triangle, but most people tell me they see a couple of Pac-Mans looking at each other. If we move to B, people see the outline of a triangle, right? And I'm going to tell you that that triangle is not there. It is suggested by those little Pac-Mans having those little chips taken out of them, such that the triangle is implied, and then the space between the Pac-Mans, there are what are called illusory contours, right? We're perceiving something. We want that whole, right? We have this perceptual organization that occurs in such a way that we see this as a whole. And I can make that even stronger, that it looks like lines to the triangle, again, that don't exist. It's just white space, that just like the white background. But if I put what look like little arms and legs on it, that don't exist. We see those illusory contours. Roll through these different principles of perceptual organization. They're sometimes called Gestalt laws, sometimes called Gestalt principles, but probably the most accurate way to refer to them or think of them is as Gestalt, as heuristics that the system uses to help us organize our perceptual space. So I have examples for all of these, but so simplicity, also called the principle of pragnans, similarity, proximity, so things that are close to each other being put together, things that are in a common region, we tend to put those things together. Good continuation, we like smooth flowing lines. synchrony, things that are happening at the same time. We're going to put those as, we're going to group those things as together, then and separate from things that are happening at a different time. Common fate, which I'll get to with a picture because it's easier, and then meaningfulness, or what's familiarity. So that first one, simplicity or pragnans. If I asked you to describe what the picture in A, my green questions are for you all. I'll try to pause a little bit. It's really different when I'm talking to a machine, but most people say either 5 circles, or sometimes they say the Olympic rings, which would actually bring in that meaningfulness / familiarity, right? That this is meaningful and familiar to us. But even if we see them as just the 5 separate circles, the point is that we're making that simple. We're forming the simple shape. I have yet to have nobody has ever said or described what's down in B, right? Where we have this almost circle shape and then a little oval that has some points on it, and then this other shape that's got chunks taken out of the circle. Nobody does that. It's not simple, it's not easy, and we tend not to perceive it that way. If I told you that's how you're supposed to perceive it, you'd go, huh, okay, but you're still going to perceive it as 5 circles, these nice simple geometric shapes. The second one is similarity. If I ask you what you see in the picture to the left, the image on your left, as you are looking at this screen, the one on your left, you can see that there is an 8, 6 that is in red. And so that we're putting red with red, and we're separating that out from the green olivey kind of color. And then the green olivey kind of color, that all goes together, right? We're putting what's similar with things that are similar to it, and separating out what's not so similar. If I ask you what you see in the image on your right, most people say columns of circles next to columns of squares, and we tend to see those as columns as we're putting the circles with the circles, separating them out from the squares. We're putting the squares with the squares. I like this picture from an old textbook, but you can see that as we're putting these two men together, we tend to see them as belonging together somehow, and you can see that they're walking in the same way, looking in the same direction. They both have these hats on. They're both holding their golf clubs in a similar manner. They are similar, and we tend to perceptually group them together. Another principle or heuristic that we use is proximity or nearness. So things that are close to each other, we're going to tend to group those things together. Things that are farther apart, we're going to be more likely to group that as being somehow separate, right? So if I ask you what you see on the image on your left, I have gotten lots of different answers to this, from the whole square to columns to rows. And if I ask my class, I usually see about a third of them raise their hands for each one of those options. Whereas if I ask you what you see on the image to the right, here most people say, I see columns of circles, right? So the column where those circles are close together are forming a column, and they're kind of more separated out. There's more space there between the next column, and so it's harder to see that as rows. We can kind of still see it as a whole square if we try, but the first thing we tend to see it as columns. And if I told you these were rows of circles, you'd be, again, you go, okay, but I'm going to tend to see those as columns of circles because I'm keeping together what's proximal or close to each other. I love this picture that I stole from Dr. Robin Morris's slides. So I don't know what that worm-looking thing is coming off of the guy on the left. Looks like it's coming off of his face, but when I ask people, and I usually point to it in class, like, who does this belong to? Everybody says to the person on the left, right? Because it's closer to him. And if we look at the Wi-Fi signal, what I now think of as a Wi-Fi signal ever since one of my students said it, who does that belong to? everybody says, right, the person on the right. It's really difficult to see it as belonging to the person on the left because it's proximal or near the person on the right. I'm going to beat this dead horse with a stick for a second so we tend to see the first image as 2 dots and then a space and then 2 dots. And we can see how we can break this up in the second image, but with this proximity effect, right? If whatever's close together, we tend to group that together and separate it out from what's separate. But I'm going to throw the first monkey wrench in here. I'm showing how I can change that, right, with common region. So those 2 dots that were close to each other before, we're now separating those out and putting them with the dots that were farther away, because now I put a circle around these 2 dots that are farther away from each other. Common region appears to trump proximity or nearness. And in the bottom figure, you can see I've done this again with the circles. This isn't actually me, it's an old either Goldstein or an old Psych 101 textbook, but I can even suggest that common region, right, with the line. So a line connecting those 2 tack things provides what is a kind of common region. It's an implied common region, and now we're putting those 2 tack things that are farther away from each other but connected by the line. We're putting those together or organizing those such that they're together. And then even though that next tack that's close to my other tack, I'm going to separate that out based on common region. And we're going to see this a couple of times where one heuristic trumps another heuristic. And I think it's interesting to think about maybe research that looks at which of these heuristics are stronger, and do we see, and we actually will see in one picture, that we have individual differences for which Gestalt principles we tend to use or tend to trump other Gestalt principles or heuristics, really. Continuation is another heuristic that we use. So if you look at the top figure and you see this black snaking line, that's a nice smoothly flowing line, I'm going to tell you it's not there, right? Like that triangle that we saw before, and we could really kind of see the lines of the triangle even though they didn't exist. That black snaking line it's not there. It is suggested by those changes from the white to the black. It has this good continuation, and we tend to see it as existing even though it doesn't. If you look at the bottom image and I ask you which ones are connected between A, B, C, and D, my students tell me A and B, right? A and B are connected, C and D are connected. These nice, smooth, flowing lines. And if I told you that instead it's actually A goes to C and D goes to B, I mean, can you even make yourself see that? You can, but it's harder, and you do that. Yeah, no, I don't like that. We want A to be connected to B with that nice smooth flowing line. We want C to be connected to D with that nice straight, smoothly flowing line. We don't like those jagged edges and corners so much. This even influences how we present our research because we want to present our research in such a way that it makes sense to people. We're not bouncing around, that we are kind of creating this nice, easy story to follow. So if I tell you that Mike has some tweets, Jill has the most tweets, Alan has the fewest tweets, and Lisa has she has slightly fewer than Jill, that's a wonky way to try to explain that. And you can see in the figure, it's not a very pretty figure. We're going to show our figures like the one on the right, right? I really kind of wish they'd change the names around so that they matched, so when I'm talking, but it makes sense for me to talk about my research in the same way, right? Mike had the fewest tweets, and then Jill, and then Alan, with Lisa having the most tweets or treats if you're like me and you can't apparently talk about how many tweets per hour these people are having. But you can see we're going to have this nice, smooth, flowing line. That's the way we like to present things. it makes it easier for people to process. Another way we perceptually organize our surroundings is by using synchrony. So things that are happening at the same time or synchronously, we tend to group those things together. Now, I've created a few slides here that are new to try and show this, but what this is trying to show, right, is that if the second, fifth, sixth, and seventh lights are on at the same time, and then we have this blinking, right, where the first, third, and fourth lights come on at a different time, even though we have that proximity, we're going to use synchrony. Synchrony tends to trump a lot of our other heuristics for perceptual organization. In an effort to show this, I have done a little bit of cropping and playing around. So those are the lights that would be on together. And then these lights would be on together. And then that's what Goldstein was trying to show when he was trying to talk about synchrony with this picture. He has taken this out of the textbook. I will say I still keep it in there because we end up coming back to these Gestalt principles when we talk about organizing our other senses. And so when we think about how this works for sound and for music and making melodies and all of these things, like hearing that the trombone is separate than the piano, synchrony becomes important again. And so I don't want to leave it out because making those, seeing those connections and repeating some of this seems really important to me. That this is really, these are the heuristics that we use in perceptual organization for more than just vision. Common fate is another principle or heuristic of perceptual organization. And we all do this all the time when we're watching those groups of birds, and they seem to all be moving together, and they seem to be a group or a flock of birds that we're kind of perceptually organizing as being together. And then some small subset will fly off in another direction, and that will perceptually segregate them, right? That'll make them come apart into two separate groups. I actually do this mental thing sometimes when I'm in that human traffic circle on Gibbs Green. There are so many people there sometimes, and we're all kind of walking along. And then I perceptually segregate myself when I walk off to Barnwell College because there's not a lot else up there. And so most of the people are going from one side to the other side, but I'm taking that little V off up north to Barnwell College. And I mentally, perceptually segregate myself. That is a little bit of someone who's been doing this for far too long. That is what goes through my mind at that human traffic circle. The image on the right is another one that I've taken from Robin Morris, and I do want you to pause and think, how would I describe this image? The idea behind this image being part of common fate was that apparently for her, all of those people who are moving in the same direction, so moving to your right, the man in front, and then there's two in the two different groups in the back, they would be perceptually organized together. And then the ones that are moving in the opposite direction, they would segregate out and they would form their own group. I actually do this in class every semester of how would you organize it? Would you put the front person off by himself? In which case it looks like the principle of similarity is he's the one who's dressed differently, right, than the other ones that have this orange color and they look more similar. Or would you put them into three separate groups, in which case it looks like the principle of proximity might be strongest for you, that there's that space between them is helping you to separate them into three separate groups. Since each of those other two groups, they have two people who are proximal to each other, and you've grouped them together. And then I do ask if people have them moving in the same direction, and there are often a few people who use this common fate. Common fate out in the world when things are moving is extremely strong. I think it trumps a lot of our Gestalt principles. But in this picture, it's more of an implied motion, which we don't always get to talk about anymore because I don't talk about perceiving motion every semester, but we do have this kind of implied motion in pictures. And for some of us, it's stronger than others. But there's a really neat study that shows if I show you a picture, where the person's moved in the direction that was implied in the first picture, you see it as being the same. You don't interpret that. You see, I ask you if it's the same or different, and you say the same, because in your mind you've moved that person along. So implied motion is it is strong, but not as strong as real motion out in the environment. And I'm glad these Gestalt principles are all going to hang together and stop here together, even though we're still going to talk a little bit about Gestalt psychology. But the final one is familiarity. You can pause this and see what you see right within all of the rocks and islands and mountains and clouds. We all see many different animals. That middle island that is like the face coming up out of the water. Again, you can pause it, and there's all kinds of stuff you can find in there, and you can keep finding them and finding them. I will say we also have a really strong predilection to find faces. Faces are probably the thing that we are most familiar with. It is something that we start to pay attention to, even as infants. We'll tend to look at people's faces. And so here again, this familiarity. The first thing we might see, maybe, I don't see this anymore so much, but as the horses with the rider, we might see that there are rocks and trees and so forth, but as soon as those faces start popping out, they become the figure, and they perceptually organize into the thing, right, that we're looking at. So familiarity is another really strong heuristic or principle that we use. And this would be the place where we allow for some of that top-down processing to occur. I'm going to leave you with this question. I want you to think about this question. I'm going to continue this into a new video, but we might think, what are some of the issues and questions in relation to how we perceive objects? So some of those issues, what I went over as challenges of object recognition specifically, and I usually do make my students come up with at least a few of those, even though there are other things people come up with as issues or questions, but things like object constancy, that I can see this in one viewing point and then recognize it in another point. Categorization, I can see a new instance of a category that I've never seen before, and I categorize it pretty easily without too much effort. Or the ambiguity on the retina, that inverse projection problem. My next question, what is lacking in the proposed theoretical approaches? So far, we've talked about recognition by components theory, which was truly a bottom-up theory of really how we're taking three-dimensional features, if you will. We're taking those features of the environment and putting them together into objects. The Gestalt principles of perceptual organization is our second approach. And a lot of those were still pretty bottom up, right? So things that are similar, that are the same color out in the environment, we're going to tend to put those together. Things that are simple or close to each other. Again, that's really what's out in the environment. And until we got to meaningfulness and familiarity, that's when we put in that top-down component. But I'm going to leave you with the question of, what do you think is lacking still? And do think about that, because we're going to continue a little bit more getting more specific about how we might be recognizing objects.